Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world for
Is that going to be?
They are the worst crimes on earth. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, atrocities involving mass execution, rape, murder and torture. On this week's talk to Al Jazeera, our guest is the United Nations' most senior human rights official, the man who must document and protest about these and other abuses around the world. In our interview, we talk about the state of global human rights and focus on the war in Syria, the crimes of ISIL, and the resulting refugee crisis in Europe. Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein has a unique perspective. He used to be the ambassador to the UN for Jordan, a country directly caught up in the turmoil, and he served as president of the UN Security Council. Neither Iraq or Syria still have a monarchy, but if they did, High Commissioner Zeid, also known as Prince Zeid, would be one of those in direct line to inherit the thrones. High Commissioner Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. You have been in the job now for a year. You are the first Muslim High Commissioner, and perhaps I would like to take you back to early on when you started the job, when you briefed the Security Council. You read a letter from 126 Muslim scholars. I'd like to ask you about that, because as you see the appalling crimes in the Arab world where you come from and in the wider Islamic world, the carnage in Syria, the executions by ISIS, the abductions of schoolgirls by Boko Haram, what do you say to those people who say that they are carrying out these crimes in the name of your religion?
It is a very good question, of course. It's very painful a year into this job to see, as you so clearly put it, a continuation of the suffering of so many people, the continuation in the commission of the crimes that we have seen so evident not just in Iraq and Syria but elsewhere. And I have to say, it's not without a sense of frustration that looking back over the course of the year, that I in my office feel quite distinctly frustration and anger. And I have to say, when we saw the body, all of us, of Ilan al-Kurdi spread out alone on that beach on the Turkish coast, we had seen many such images before, but that image changed very much the way the world viewed the plight of Syrians fleeing the conflict. And I think for all of us, it made us feel extraordinarily frustrated, because we like to feel that with all the protests and all the speeches and all the comments, that we can end the suffering of people. And I have to say, I feel still very frustrated that we're seemingly unable to do it.
You mentioned one little boy earlier on, Ilan Kurdi, who was one of those fleeing Syria. But there are thousands of little boys and girls that we haven't really taken notice of, who died in Syria over more than 4 years.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we've seen those images. And there was a concern that the international community was becoming numb because it was exposed to too much horror almost. And so, in actual fact, we had a discussion in the office. Why was it that that picture produced the result that so many other pictures, so much other footage was incapable of producing? And there was something about the loneliness of this poor boy's body on the sand, the way he lay there with his shorts and his socks and shoes, that really made everyone wake up and believe this suffering of the Syrian people has lasted long enough, and it needs to come to an end. And we need to see an end to the terrible violence that has been wrought in that country.
Let's talk about the specific crimes and abuses that are taking place. President Bashar al-Assad says there's no such thing as barrel bombs. What is the evidence you have?
Oh, I think there's almost indisputable evidence. And the Commission of Inquiry, the multiple sources of the evidence that has been collected, I think would suggest that it's undeniable. And as I said on previous occasions, there will be justice for the victims.
Could a barrel bomb ever be a legitimate tool of war?
Absolutely not. It's so indiscriminate in terms of who it will, what damage it will cause to a building that has been flattened, that even if the argument were made that there were some legitimate military targets there, the fact that the excessive civilian casualties would accrue renders it an object of that is clearly the use of which is a violation of international humanitarian law.
So is the indiscriminate use of barrel bombs, in your view, a war crime?
Absolutely. It has to be proven in a court of law. We always say that what we see is suggestive of that, and a court of law properly constituted will make a confirmation as to that particular issue. But certainly from what we see, the suggestion is that war crimes and crimes against humanity, yes, may have well been committed in Syria.
Of course, Assad's regime aren't the only people committing crimes. You have the appalling brutality of ISIL. But can I ask you a clear question in terms of those mass executions by ISIL? Who is actually killing more Syrians, ISIL or Assad, in your estimation?
Well, I think we believe that barrel bombings account for the greater number. That's not to excuse those non-state actors like Daesh or ISIL from the crimes that they have also committed in respect of the Syrian people and the civilians who have suffered as a result of this. We believe there needs to be accountability across the board, that you cannot have impunity when crimes of such a nature, planned and organized, are left as if nothing happened.
You've been in a unique position to watch the tragedy of Syria unfold because you're in your job now documenting the human rights abuses. Previously, you were Jordan's ambassador to the United Nations, one of the countries most affected. You served on the Security Council. You were president of the Security Council. So, a question about the Security Council. It is still divided. If it was united, would it make a difference?
Yes, and I, at the time, in my capacity as the ambassador of my country, and now in my capacity as High Commissioner for Human Rights, still believe that the initiative that is now being championed by the French government of having a voluntary sort of break on the use of the veto by the permanent members whenever crimes of an international nature, i.e. crimes against humanity, war crimes or genocide, are alleged to be ongoing, that the veto is not used. And I believe that position needs to become a stronger position.
Given it's 4.5 years, do you think what's your view of the fact that Russia and the US, yes, we had the Geneva conference with lots of people there, but Russia, the US, and the regional powers, including the Gulf countries and Iran, haven't sat down around the table to try and resolve this? Some sort of contact group. Wouldn't that be the best way forward?
Well, I'm not going to go into the political dynamics because we are a human rights office, and so we look at the violations and how we could, of course, end them. Any action that leads toward the halting the enormous bloodshed in Syria is an action that we would support.
What does it say about the international community and the United Nations? And here we are on the 70th anniversary of the UN being set up in the aftermath of World War II. Never again was the message that something like Syria is happening now.
Well, I mean, it's a terrible indictment. One understands that the UN cannot do everything, and with the meager resources the UN has at its disposal, it's trying valiantly in many theaters to try and bring the fighting to an end. Staffan de Mistura hasn't wasted a minute in coming up with ideas. Neither were his two illustrious predecessors sort of idle when it came to working on Syria. Far from it, they were Kofi Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi were heavily invested in terms of their own efforts to come to a solution. But the UN, of course, needs the buy-in of the member states, and there has to be a collective effort to try and stem the bloodletting wherever we may be present.
Some people have made it out of Syria. They've, at great risk, gone by land and sea to try and get to a place of refuge. They've got to what they thought was the place of refuge, Europe, and in a number of countries they have not found a welcome. In particular, Hungary, where we've had riot police using water cannon, using tear gas. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I find it utterly appalling, really. The reactions and the policies of the Hungarian government are of great surprise to me. Next year we'll be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Hungarian uprising. And one has to recall that in the first 9 weeks, 164,000 Hungarians fled Hungary to the neighboring states, principally Austria and Yugoslavia. Eventually, 200,000 Hungarians were settled in 37 countries. And how can it be, 60 years later, that the political leadership in Hungary seems to have forgotten this? And I really find it almost inexcusable, and especially when contrasting this with the genuine generosity of many ordinary Hungarians who understand that these people are suffering people, by and large refugees, but even if they were not, if they were migrants, the conditions which led to their departure doesn't mean that in any way they don't have human rights as well, the rights to a dignified reception and the rights to counsel, the rights to health. You know, for instance, the Czech Republic, we see refugees being detained in conditions that are reported to us as being appalling. And how can this be, given the suffering of Europe throughout the 20th century, the early part? And so I'm very unhappy, and I've expressed my concerns and my alarm in unambiguous terms. It has elicited a sharp response from the Hungarian government, but I'm not subdued by this. I will continue to speak out because I think it's so appalling, these people who have suffered so much in Syria, principally, that they have to be treated in this way.
Some of the people give requests for asylum and then they are rejected, it seems, without even being read en masse. Do you believe there are breaches of international law here?
There could well be. I think more to the point, though, there's a mean-spiritedness among many of the politicians in particularly, sadly, Eastern Europe, but not limited to Eastern Europe. And I have to say, we in the human rights community have saluted the position of Chancellor Merkel because we find it enlightened, and we feel this is very much the attitude that the rest of Europe must take. And we see now the sort of rearguard actions to the proposal put forward of what's called burden sharing. But even the use of the word burden is regrettable, because they are not a burden. They are a potential asset. And Europe, in its demography and in terms of its economic needs a great deal of skilled and unskilled foreign labor in the future if it's going to sustain its economic growth. And so to use the word burden is perhaps rather sad.
You've criticised the language of some politicians. I do need to raise some of the comments from the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who has basically made it clear he doesn't want Muslims. He says they're not welcome. He wants to uphold his Christian tradition. What do you say to that?
Well, again, it's absolutely shocking, this. I mean, if after the end of the Cold War, there were Western European countries that said that they didn't want any Eastern Europeans living amongst the Western communities, you know, there would have been a very strong reaction from the Eastern European countries. We cannot go back to a world of ethnically pure states where somehow eugenics has a sort of role in this. We are far from that. The world has suffered enough from those sorts of rather reptilian policies. I say reptilian because they're rather primitive. We need a much more enlightened approach, and I believe that Chancellor Merkel's position is one of great leadership, and now the rest of Europe must also show likewise a generosity in keeping with the feelings of the people of Europe, which are not all xenophobic and anti-Muslim.
I'd like to turn to some other areas of the world quickly now. Sri Lanka. You've just produced a very important report on Sri Lanka. Very quickly, if you could summarise what you found in terms of what happened during the end of the Civil War and the period immediately after that.
what needs to be stressed is that this was a human rights investigation. It was not a criminal investigation. We weren't looking at identifying individuals and their criminal culpability. We were looking at broader patterns of gross human rights violations, which we believe were suggestive of crimes against humanity and war crimes. And as such, it was a very broad brush that we were applying, but it was clear that in the acquisition of testimonies from so many witnesses, that the degree of the violence, whether it be torture, sexual violence, or even in the form of enforced disappearances, suggested organization and planning, and therefore raised these crimes from ordinary crimes into being crimes of concern to the international community as a whole.
On this programme 2 years ago, I spoke to the then President of Sri Lanka, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and I asked him who had ultimate responsibility. Did you have ultimate responsibility? And he said yes. Should anyone have immunity from your hybrid court, the former president or even the current president who was for a time the acting defence minister at the end of the war?
No one should have any form of amnesty or immunities. Absolutely not.
Let me move on to allegations of sexual abuse by peacekeepers, some of them serving with the UN, some of them serving alongside the UN, particularly in the Central African Republic, where there have been some very damning allegations about abuse and also about the UN being very slow to respond to that abuse. I know there's an inquiry underway, but you also, earlier in your career, 10 years ago, was the person who was appointed by the then Secretary General Kofi Annan to investigate these sort of crimes. You came up with a report that said there should be zero tolerance. What's your view that this is all happening again?
Well, it was happening throughout, regrettably. It's very sad for me to realize that notwithstanding our efforts 10 years ago, and I again perhaps regret that I know more about these crimes than almost anyone else. I have seen the most graphic imagery of children being raped 10 years ago. I have sat in on testimony given by those children who were allegedly raped by UN peacekeepers. I understand the context very well. All of it's abominable and inexcusable. And we came out with a set of very concrete recommendations. And I was very clear when I briefed the General Assembly and the Security Council 10 years ago that all of it had to be implemented if we were going to see it end. Sadly, about half was implemented. And many of the key recommendations were not. And principally it was the member states that refused to implement these recommendations. They refused to have court-martials basically be conducted on site where the crimes were allegedly committed. They refused to have an independent, highly mobile, highly scientific investigative capacity very close to the site where these allegations would take place. They refused to have DNA samples given by all of those who go to the field as a means of deterring those who may think otherwise. This was rejected by the member states. And most of all, is there is a draft treaty in the General Assembly that's been stuck now really for almost 9 years because the member states are not willing to approve it.
As you know, the actions of the UN leadership are also under investigation, as is your office. If you find wrongdoing in your office, will you take action? Will you fire people? If you yourself are criticised in the report, will you consider your position?
I have said to the member states, if there is any comment regarding my conduct, I would gladly listen to it and try and understand what I did wrong. I still believe that I was acting well within my authority to do what I did. Until I hear otherwise, I don't see where it is that I got it wrong. But because on receipt of the information, I acted the way I should have acted. And I was not briefed when I first stepped into this job about the allegations of crimes committed in the CAR. Beyond a cursory comment made to me in November, which is all part of the public record, it's all come out. And I was made to understand that the French authorities were already investigating. And so I wasn't briefed on the extent to which the allegations were not just there and standing regarding the French troops, but many of the other troops in the Central African Republic. And I was utterly shocked that earlier this year, I understand suddenly that we have all these other allegations that weren't being sort of pursued with the government in question in full. Some of it was, not all of it. So I'm not happy, certainly, by this. It's very difficult for me as the High Commissioner for Human Rights to speak to governments plainly, to encourage them, sometimes criticize them, if we on the UN side stand accused of these dreadful crimes. And we will continue to press the governments. I continue to press the French government for information. They say that they can't disclose anything. The inquiries are underway. But I hope sometime soon they will let us know where these inquiries have led to.
High Commissioner, you do a very tough job. And I'm calling you High Commissioner, but I could be calling you Your Highness Prince Zeid. You, very early on, decided to join the UN, to go to one of the most dangerous parts of the world then, to Bosnia, to UNPROFOR, a UN mission. Why do you do this work when you are royal? You could be living a very privileged life not doing this sort of work.
You're asking me a personal question.
I am.
And I'm not prepared, not prepared for it.
I'm just trying to work out what makes you tick.
Well, the first experience in the former Yugoslavia was an overwhelming experience, emotional experience for anyone who was there at the time. And only a few months ago, we had, for the first time, a discussion between all the principal international actors who were close to the scene when Srebrenica fell, and then, of course, close to the genocidal acts that occurred thereafter. And we had a meeting to go through, hour by hour almost, what happened at the time of Srebrenica and why did we get it wrong. And for me it was extraordinary because in 20 years we didn't have this discussion at an earlier juncture. Why did we get it so wrong? And what was so clear to us is that we simply misread Ratko Mladic completely. That there were signs that the Srebrenica was going to be sort of overrun militarily. I think this was unmistakable. The Bosnian Serbs were communicating this to the international community. But that you would move from a military operation to a genocidal act, I think this was rather astonishing to us, and yet the people of Srebrenica knew that this was going to happen. All of this will be confirmed in the proceedings now currently underway at the ICTY. But for us, going back over all of this, it was astonishing how we couldn't see the signs. And to be honest, I wonder 20 years later, are we still in that position where we're not able to read the cipher, so to speak, of a conflict in such a way that we can prevent atrocities from happening. And I think it was that experience that then forged in me this desire to pursue this.
My final question is also, I hope you don't mind, a personal question, because you are from the Hashemite line. Your family are the Kingdom of Jordan, but you also were the kings of Iraq and Syria, and you are in that royal line. Do you feel in any way, given so much of your work now is concerning Iraq and Syria, almost a sense of destiny?
I don't feel that. I feel I have to be as fair as I can with all member states. It doesn't privilege any member state over any other. Indeed, when I felt compelled to criticize my own country over the reimposition of the death penalty in December of last year, I faced a torrent of ill feeling from many, especially those on various websites, who felt that I had somehow betrayed the country after serving the country for so many years. And it even reached the point where my mother called me up and told me, my son, my friends are saying some things about you, and can you tone it down a little bit? But in this position, I think one knows that one cannot possibly discriminate. And we have been absolutely, I think, true to our belief when we see the evidence and it calls for criticizing or commenting on the conduct of all states. We comment on the conduct of all states, having privileged none or discriminated against none. And I think so. I hope that we are viewed as professionals, and that's certainly how I think we view ourselves.
High Commissioner Zeid, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.